Over the past year or so, I've made a few batches of pots into which I've mixed coarse iron spangles. The results from doing this seem to be rather arbitrary, but in a few instances it's led to some really lovely pots, so I decided to do it again on a larger scale, and this video will document how I mix it into the clay and then how I throw and trim an angular vase with it from about 3 pounds of clay, which is about 1,360 grams. This stoneware clay body already contains iron, and it does produce iron blossoms like you saw earlier, but without the added iron, they don't occur so often. To mix it in, I grab a handful of spangles, sprinkle them onto the clay, roll it up, and then I spend a few moments smearing this lump across the table with the hope of distributing these tiny specks of metal evenly throughout the body before I spiral wedge the clay up properly. If I were to just spiral wedge this lump after sprinkling the iron on, I think it would take an age for the iron to be mixed evenly, and this stretching and rolling seems like it does a good job, and it's worth being thorough, as it would be a pain if I threw a batch of pots like this, only for all that extra iron to be concentrated in one specific area of the pot, or only on the inside walls, which is something I've had happen in the past. Truth be told, there's probably a million ways of doing this, and I'm sure countless other potters out there have various different ways of mixing aggregates into their clay, and I think if I was doing this on a much larger scale, I would be weighing out the iron spangles and the clay it's added to, and I'd mix together much larger blocks of the stuff before weighing out individual lumps to throw with. Then, after a thorough mixing, I'll give it a quick spiral wedge, just to really bring the piece of clay together, and to remove any pockets of air there might be, and lastly, to make it into a shape that's conducive to being chucked onto the wheel and then thrown with. And what I mean by that is I want to create a shape at this stage that's smooth and even on the outside. That way when I begin to centre it, the piece of clay will move smoothly under my hands. If at this stage I create a rough, oddly shaped lump with lots of corners and edges, then that would only make the centering process itself more difficult. So, once I've wedged up this lump, I gradually begin to use less pressure and roll it up into a conical shape with a rounded bottom. And once again, this is hopefully what this clay body will look like once fired and coated in glaze. You can see that some of the particles of iron make it all the way to the surface, where they melt and bleed into large metallic pools, whereas sometimes others don't even make it all the way through. I tend to use relatively firm clay when throwing these angular shapes, which can make centering more of a nuisance, especially for the first cone, which is when the clay is forced upwards into a conical shape with a rounded top before it's pushed back down again. This sort of acts like centering on the wheel, and if the wedged up lump of clay you've thrown down feels a little bit off, coning it up and down 2 or 3 or even 4 times makes the lump of clay spin so much more smoothly beneath your hands. For some shapes I don't bother, especially mugs and bowls, where subtle irregularities can quite easily be dealt with. But with larger pots that are perhaps more complex in nature, it helps to no end. When I'm centering, often, instead of reaching for more water, I'll instead scrape the slip off the wheel head and drag it back up the cone to help hydrate the clay. If, when you're centering, things get too dry, the process simply becomes more difficult, as your hands will begin to stick to the lump of clay and it won't move quite so easily beneath your hands. And like I said before, with softer clay this would be a speedier process. You'll know if you've spent too long centering clay, if you're using a grogged one at least, when you can begin to feel all the coarse particles of sand as the clay around them has slowly turned to slip and eroded. And this is the rough shape I'm aiming for, a lowish lump with a flat top and slightly tapering sides. From this point, I can make a well in this lump, which I do by pressing my 2 thumbs into the middle, whilst at the same time containing the clay on the outside with the rest of my hands, and then use the tip of my index finger like a hook to drag the base outwards, as the fingers of my left hand follow it, compressing the thin base and controlling the thick expanse of the outer wall at the same time. I then bend my thumb and use that to compress the clay on the bottom, which is something that's a good habit to learn to do, as compressing the clay down here can prevent things like S-cracks from occurring later on. Generally, before I do the first pull, I collar the walls inward so they're facing directly upwards as opposed to splaying outward slightly. This way the clay is facing the direction I want to pull it. I then force my knuckle into the bottom and pinch it against my fingertips on the inside. This is a process potters call pulling up, and I recently made a much longer, far more in-depth video about it, which I'll leave a link to on screen now and in the description below. In between each pull, I collar the walls in. I do this because, generally, As the clay is pulled up, the walls typically become straighter, and if I didn't collar the walls in between each pull, there's a chance the form of the pot would begin to splay outward more and more each time, and as the pot gets thinner and taller, the walls can be much more difficult to push inwards into a nice collared shape. So by keeping on top of it from the beginning, you should hopefully have more luck throwing taller, stronger pots. It's worth noting that I can just about feel those extra iron spangles, but they don't make the clay too coarse and uncomfortable to use. You may find some stonewares out there that are so coarse that they literally feel like sandpaper to throw with, and after a day using it, one's hands are left red and raw. The clay is pulled up slowly in gradual movements that, once started, don't stop or waver, and instead go from bottom to top in one sweeping motion. The simple rule is, if you move your hands irregularly, then those irregularities will just be imparted on the walls of the pot, resulting in wobbles and thin sections, and potentially the collapse of your pot. With each pull I douse the walls in water, and for this pot I was using a soaked sponge to do the pulling on the outside, which more or less does the exact same thing my knuckle does, in terms of the pressure used and the route it follows. The only difference is that the wet sponge provides hydration the whole way up, yet at the same time it does create some kind of barrier between my fingertips and the clay of the pot, and this dulling of a tactile sensation isn't always a good thing, as it can be more difficult to detect if anything's going wrong in the wall. At this stage, as I'm pulling the walls up to gain height, I'm throwing in the very rough shape of the pot I want to end up with, and as you can see it has a narrow base, a bulbous belly, and walls on the top that collar in slightly, which I purposefully leave a bit thick, just so there's enough material in them later on for forming the neck and the rim of the vase, and from this point onwards I'll begin exaggerating that shape, but I won't throw in the more distinct angles until a bit later on, as once those straight planes have been created and sharp angles have been set, it can be quite difficult to undo them, so I prefer to leave the vase quite curvaceous right up until the end. I like these forms to have quite narrow bases, but there is sort of a limit as to what's possible at this stage, as if I were to make it too narrow at this point, it makes throwing a wide waist and an angular form really quite difficult, so I prefer to leave the narrow base a bit thicker, and then, once it's leather hard, I can simply trim it back to the size I really want, achieving a shape that I probably wouldn't be able to throw. And now that I've distributed the clay evenly throughout the walls, I'll begin throwing in the more distinct angles, which is something I do with my fingertips instead of a sponge. I begin with the base, thinning it and angling it out more so. I have a rough rule for these shapes, which is that the narrow base section should account for about half of the overall pot size. If it's say a third, then the shape tends to be a bit squat, and it looks simply as if I've just divided it into 3 separate portions. Next comes the waist, which is thrown in such a way that it tapers in slightly. Next, there's the shoulder, which slopes back in, and it's the part of the vessel that will ultimately lead to the lip of the pot, which means really there's 4 distinct parts to these: the base, the waist, the shoulder, and the lip. And I find that the hardest thing when making these isn't the throwing or the trimming, rather it's getting the proportions right, as sometimes the tiniest subtleties make the biggest differences, and even just angles that differ in degree by a tiny amount can either make the pot work or fail, and I still, certainly, don't always get it right, but I am getting better at identifying when it is and when it isn't, and I'm quick to destroy the pots which don't, recycling the stoneware back into usable clay that can be thrown into new pots. Now that the shape is getting closer, I'll begin to further define the angles in the shape, little by little, and mostly I'm pushing out with my inside hand as my digits on the outside brace that pressure and help move the clay where I want it to go. Throughout this entire process, I've kept my wheel speed fairly consistent for the shaping. If you suddenly speed the wheel up or slow it down, it'll do the same thing as what happens when you suddenly move your hands faster or slower when you're pulling the walls up, which is that it adds some kind of irregularity to the now quite thin walls of the pot. And now that the shape is roughly there, I can begin to run through the finishing off procedures. This starts by scraping away some of that excess clay from around the base. Then I'll take my sponge on a stick and I'll soak up all of the water that's left in the bottom of the pot. As if I leave the water inside the pot overnight, it can soak and saturate through the base of the vessel, disintegrating the stoneware, or if that doesn't happen, it'll just ensure that the base section of the pot remains damp and unworkable for a much longer time. I then use a straight-edged kidney to further define the walls and to remove all that wet slip that covers the surface of the spinning pot. My fingers on the outside are pushing out against the metal edge, and as the tool itself is so straight, as long as I hold that firmly in place and I push the clay out against it, it'll ensure that each flat plane of this vase is nice and straight. For more delicate parts, such as this thin overhanging shoulder, I'll switch the metal rib out for a plastic one, just for the initial scrape over, as the smooth plastic flows a bit better over the clay. And at this point I really don't want it to snag, as any ill movements on this part of the pot could cause some rather irreversible damage, as if one side of the shoulder begins to sag, it'll also cause the rim to drop a bit too, and if that happens the whole shape is more or less lost, and so sometimes I switch between different materials, as some simply work better for certain jobs. Although it isn't very obvious, if you look at the rim you'll see that it is undulating up and down ever so slightly, and in some cases where I don't want to use a needle to remove lots of clay, I'll just use the edge of this old trimming tool, the same I used for tidying up the base, which I hold very steadily over the rim and I let the undulation run into it, and thus removing it and levelling out the top. I then use a water-soaked chamois leather, which is draped over the rim just to neaten everything up one final bit. As I felt like the bottom half of this pot was a bit thin, I didn't want to lift it off the wheel immediately with my hands, so instead I spent about 1.5 minutes blasting the lower section with a heat gun, just to dry out the clay a bit so that I could lift the pot away without it deforming. A taut, twisted metal wire is then dragged beneath the pot and then it's carefully lifted over onto the wearboard. And that's it for a day of throwing pots. Cleanup is quick. I just dump all my tools into this bucket of water and I roughly clean each. I don't worry about removing every last speck of clay, as these tools will probably just be used again the following day. Once everything's washed and the clay has settled in the bucket, I can pour away the clean water and then I just pour the clay sludge that's left in the bucket back into my reclaim. As for the wheel and the little wooden desk that sits in front of me, I just give both a quick wipe with the sponge, and once finished, I wring this sponge out clean in the same bucket I wash the tools in. I don't clean out the actual tray itself in between each making session. Instead, I usually do that at the end of the week. Or, if it gets filled up with trimmings when I'm turning, I simply empty it as I go. I left the pot to sit out overnight, and by the following morning it was more or less perfectly leather hard and ready to trim. I attach it back onto the wheel by placing it onto a pool of slip, and then I tap center the pot. The slip quickly dries, and I suppose sort of like glue, it helps hold the piece down onto the metal wheel head. I also just blend a tiny portion of the base into the wheel too, and with both of these precautions it holds the pot really firmly in place, and it means I don't have to use something like a Giffen grip or 3 lumps of clay pushed around the base to hold the pot in place, which means there's nothing that gets in the way of my trimming, and I can turn the entire outside form of the pot, save the base, which I always do afterwards. I began just by turning away a slight undulation that existed in the rim, and I also trimmed the inner portion of the wall here so that the internal form sort of flows outwards towards the beveled edge on the very lip of the pot, whereas previously the rim just overhung slightly, which made the vase appear more enclosed than I would have liked. I then ran my fingers down the walls of the pot, gauging the thickness of the clay beneath them, just so I know how much to remove. I then used the corner of my hook turning tool to gouge away an outer layer to thin out the narrow base. When removing a lot of mass from a pot, I prefer to use a focus edge to trim with, or a corner like this, as I feel like I can remove more clay without the possibility of anything going wrong, as the area of contact is so small. If I was to use the entire blade at once to remove clay, the amount of pressure I'd have to push in order for it to work properly may cause the walls of the pot to buckle inwards, and this will be even more prevalent if you are using tools which aren't particularly sharp. Hence why it's so important you trim when the clay is the right condition. If the clay is too hard, you'll have to apply so much pressure only for a small amount of clay to be removed. And there's actually quite a high chance that you can injure your wrist, the one that's pushing in with the turning tool, if you're trimming pots that are way too hard. Equally, if you're trimming pots that are far too soft and the trimmings are just sticking back onto the pot, not only are you making the process more difficult for yourself, as you have to constantly pick away these trimmed away ribbons of clay, but if the walls of the pot are too soft and you apply a lot of pressure with a trimming tool, then the walls of the pot will just deform, and once again the whole pot could be easily ruined just because you didn't let it dry out for long enough. As I'm turning straight planes, it makes sense that I use a tool which has a straight edge, as by simply holding the tool up to each individual part of this pot, I can see whether it's straight or not. My fingers on my left hand follow inside the pot opposite of where the blade's working, and by doing this I can constantly judge the thickness of that portion of wall. I can also feel immediately if anything begins to bow or buckle inwards, if it's been trimmed too thinly. What I like about this bison tool in particular is the right angled end of the blade, as it makes trimming in very distinct changes in angle very easy. Although, like all of these incredibly sharp tungsten carbide tools, it's quite easy to get carried away and trim away too much, especially if you lose control of the blade, hence why I grasp a wooden handle and the metal ferrule so firmly when using it. If I need even more control, I'll brace my thumbs together, all with the aim of stabilising my movements. I'm sure this base portion will need a bit more turning, but I'll wait until the vessel has been flipped upside down to do that. Lastly, for this part of the pot, I still wasn't quite happy with the rim. I wanted the lip itself to be finer, and there were some quite prominent turning marks just on the underside of the beveled edge, so I trimmed over these parts again, further refining them and making the edge as crisp as I could. As the lip is beveled, the thin edge gives you the perception that the entire pot is wafer thin, even when that might not necessarily be the case. If you can imagine that I left the rim thick and chunky at this stage, you'd perceive that the whole rest of the vessel beneath followed suit, which is why rims of pots are so important, as they convey to us so much information about the pot before it's even picked up. Once trimmed, I wet the rim, compress the clay a bit with my fingertips, and then I also burnish it with the smooth side of a rubber kidney, which compresses any sharp particles of grog back into the clay and makes it feel just so much better. I don't do this for all the pots I make, only those which have had rims that I've trimmed. And in this case too I burnished the inner portion of the lip, very much for the same reason. I then tuck a sharp metal edge beneath the pot to detach it, clean off the wheel head, and empty the vase of any turnings that might be left inside after I trim the rim. The vase is then carefully placed down, making sure that it isn't lowered onto any specks of clay that could embed themselves back into the rim I just so carefully finished. I lightly tap center it, and then I push 3 lumps of soft clay around the rim to hold the pot in place as I trim the tapering walls and the base. For these supportive lugs, it helps to use clay that's neither too firm nor too soft. If it's too firm, you'll have to push onto them with more pressure, and the chance you'll inadvertently damage the rim is much greater. Equally, if they're too soft, then there's a chance they'll stick to the rim and they can be troublesome to remove. The base is always a bit trickier to turn than the rest of the pot, as because it isn't attached down so securely, there's always the tendency that the pot wants to move and shift out of place as it's being trimmed. This means that as I turn, I'm applying constant downward pressure with my left hand to help keep the pot pinned in place. I bevel the outer edge and I smooth over the base, and lastly I stamp in my maker's mark, pushing it and rocking it from corner to corner so that it leaves a nice impression. You'll see some light chattering on the surface of this pot, although I can assure you it's barely noticeable when you touch it, and once glazed they'll be completely hidden under a layer of thick glass. What the pot feels unnaturally light at this point, which is a good thing as the glaze that goes onto it does add a considerable amount of weight, yet at the same time I don't want them to be too light, and I have been leaving the base portions to be slightly more sturdy, as I have had some excessively turned pots slump just around the base, which ruins the angularity of the form. Nonetheless, I was happy with this one, and I can't wait to see it fired, to see all of those tiny iron spangles melt and bleed into the glaze, and hopefully making a very interesting surface, which means, in the future, I'll have to make an updated version of this video, which shows the glazing, the firing, and the finished result. Thanks so much for watching, as always, especially those of you who make it all the way to the end, and it always makes me happy to hear from those who did. I'll see you next week.